Hello, History 362. So I decided before we actually talk about the campaigns of Alexander that it's worth taking one more pause and talking about the sources for Alexander. And this is, I think, thinking about sources and evaluating sources is one of the most important skills, life skills, that you can take away from ancient history. Because again, as you go out in the big wide world, one of the things you're constantly going to be able to do, you're going to need to do, is evaluate your sources for information, whether it's stuff you're reading in the newspaper, seeing on TV, spewing from the mouths of various politicians, turning up in the cesspool that is the internet. You're going to have to evaluate where you're getting your information, why you think it's worth acting upon. Now, one important fact, in fact, maybe the salient fact about all of our surviving written sources for Alexander is that they mostly come not from the 4th century or the Hellenistic world. They all come from the Roman Empire. The sources that survive for us are produced in a Roman imperial context. And therefore we have to be, I think, very aware that our vision of Alexander is one that is very much filtered through the concerns of the Roman imperial elite. Now, our most important source for Alexander's campaigns is a Roman writer named Aryan. Now, Aryan is a native Greek speaker. He's from Bithynia. His full name is Flavius Arrhianus, so he's a Roman citizen. He, growing up, becomes very, very interested in philosophy and studies under the great Stoic philosopher Epictetus. But he also goes into the Roman military and administration. So he has served as a provincial governor. He has commanded troops in the field, helping to repel an invasion of armed horsemen coming in over the Caucasus, and has actually written about the tactics that he employs on that occasion. He's serving and writing in the time of Hadrian, the Emperor Hadrian, in the early 2nd century AD. Now, as a result, Aryan is probably concerned with a couple things. One, he is very interested in imperial administration, something he's taken part in. He's also very, very interested in military tactics. Aryan gives us Alexander as a almost fussy tactician, using a whole host of intricate and carefully thought out tactics. And I think at times, as if you're reading or studying one of Alexander's battles, you do have to be careful. Is this Alexander putting together these careful tactics? Or is this Aryan, the kind of almost academic tactician, although he has commanded armies in the field successfully, giving us a kind of intricate vision of the mechanics of the Macedonian army, maybe a little too intricate at times. Now, Aryan used a key source for Aryan was Ptolemy I. And indeed, as we kind of work back, we start saying, okay, all our sources are from the Roman Empire. What are our sources? And Aryan did have access to true primary sources, eyewitness accounts that we lack. The most important of these is Ptolemy I. Ptolemy is initially a relatively junior officer in Alexander's army, although he's given somewhat more important assignments later on in the campaign. But Ptolemy, after Alexander's death, becomes the king of Egypt and the founder of the Ptolemaic dynasty. And it seems that he's writing his history of service under Alexander the Great to both glorify Alexander the Great, but also to emphasize his claim to rule as someone who had served Alexander loyally, and may even somewhat exaggerate his role in Alexander's army. So he has an agenda, but he is an eyewitness, at least to certain things. And Ptolemy may use some sources that again are also lost to us. Another source, probably used both by Ptolemy and perhaps still extant for Aryan, is Callisthenes. Callisthenes was a nephew of Aristotle, He was brought into Alexander's entourage and went on the campaign specifically to serve as a historian, and wrote, it seems, kind of 2 short histories of Alexander's campaigns. Now, unfortunately for Callisthenes, he is implicated in a plot to assassinate Alexander, and is executed for treason on campaign. So he doesn't actually write down to Alexander's death because he predeceases Alexander. But again, he is someone who, on one hand, is an eyewitness, but also, of course, is somewhat writing a biased history. He's writing a courtly history, although he is writing a history of someone who is probably starting off glorifying Alexander, and it seems at some point also becomes somewhat disillusioned with some of Alexander's increasingly autocratic pretensions. So we have Ptolemy as a source, Callisthenes as a primary source that influences our sources. Another primary source that is a source for our sources is an officer named Aristobulus, who seems to have been probably some kind of administrator. It's unclear if he really is assigned really military roles. Although, again, for the people, the companions moving with Alexander, oftentimes it's kind of vague whether they hold military or civil positions. That's not necessarily a strict distinction in the Macedonian court or even in Macedonian society. We don't hear about him on the battlefield. But he also writes a work that describes Alexander's campaigns and deeds, and that is again probably used both by Ptolemy and also by Aryan, who explicitly says that he thinks Ptolemy and Aristobulus are 2 of his best sources. In addition, Alexander has an admiral named Nyarkus, who is used by Aryan for a separate work describing India. And Nyarkus had actually sailed back from India, commanding Alexander's a fleet that Alexander had assembled. So So again, all of these guys are missing. We don't have Ptolemy, even though he was a king. His work doesn't survive. We don't have Callisthenes. We don't have Aristobulus, and we don't have Nyarkus. But we do have Aryan, who used them. Now, Aryan isn't the only writer who wrote about Alexander the Great in the Roman imperial period. Another very important source is Plutarch. Plutarch of Chaeronea is sort of a somewhat older contemporary of Aryan, and he lives a very long life. Plutarch is from Boeotia in Greece. He is a very proud Greek citizen. He's a priest at Delphi. He's also a citizen of Rome. He has Roman citizenship. And in some ways, one of his real interests is sort of thinking simultaneously about the glory and grandeur of Greece and also the reality, not necessarily an unpleasant one, of the Roman Empire. And this is manifested, and Plutarch writes a huge amount. He's a voluminous writer, and a tremendous amount of Plutarch has survived. But his most famous work are the parallel lives, in which he compares a Greek worthy with a Roman worthy. And this is some way of noting how Greeks and Romans can both obtain greatness, demonstrate vices, have flaws, and also have great virtues. And so each Greek worthy and Roman worthy is paired, and that's why they're called parallel lives. And Alexander the Great is, surprise, surprise, paired with Julius Caesar, both great conquerors, both who die maybe a little before their time. Now, Plutarch straight up says, I don't consider myself a historian. I am a biographer. And my goal is to produce a biography that gives an insight into the character of the person. And he even says sometimes a sort of casual remark or a gesture can tell us more than a detailed depiction of a battle. So Plutarch is explicitly not trying to give us a political or administrative or diplomatic or military history. He actually is trying to get at the character of Alexander. And there are risks that he also wishes to impose some of his own interests. For example, it's clear to Plutarch that Alexander is drinking a lot. Plutarch tells us as much in his biography. But for Plutarch, for a Greek with philosophical training, that excess drinking is sort of a vice that Plutarch seems a little uncomfortable with. At one point he even says, everyone thought Alexander was drinking too much, but no, he was just talking philosophy all night and just held one cup all night. He was too busy talking to actually drain it, which, of course, makes Alexander much more like a sort of Greek genteel intellectual in Plutarch's circle than probably the extremely hard-drinking, violence-prone king that at times he was. So again, Plutarch also potentially has his biases and blind spots, but the life of Alexander is nonetheless extremely important, in part because it actually gives us a continuous narrative of Alexander's life, and is at times more it gives us aspects beyond just the military details that appeal to someone like Aryan, who was really interested in the military and administrative details of Alexander's empire. Now, Plutarch likewise is reading some of Aryan's self-same sources, Ptolemy, Clisthenes, Aristobulus. He also is drawing on what is sometimes referred to as the Vulgate tradition, stories about Alexander that we're not quite sure where they came from. Some of them are actually somewhat negative. So others are just simply tall tales. A story, for example, that an Amazon woman comes out of the desert and she and Alexander have wild sex for an extended period of time and then she leaves. That would be kind of part of the Vulgate tradition. A key part of the Vulgate tradition, now lost, was a history by someone named Pletarch. It seems to be kind of the cornerstone of the Vulgate tradition, although again, there are a lot of stories that are circulating about Alexander that can get kind of picked up at any time, and it's hard for us to evaluate where they came from if we can't try to pin them back on, well, maybe this came from Ptolemy or Clisthenes. So Plutarch gives us some of the Vulgate tradition. Two other authors in the Roman period also preserve this kind of Vulgate tradition. One is Curtius Rufus, who writes a history of Alexander the Great in Latin. We're not quite sure when he wrote. It's debated exactly when Curtius Rufus wrote, probably 1st century AD. So certainly in the imperial period, but his exact identity is still somewhat obscure. Also, we have Diodorus Siculus, who was writing in the early Roman Empire. He's writing a grand parallel history of the Greek and Roman world that is arranged chronologically. But the parts of Diodorus describe the campaigns of Alexander, and he also seems to have drawn relatively heavily on the Vulgate tradition. So overall, we have we do have good literary sources for Alexander that give us narrative history. Much of this history is extraordinarily valuable. Obviously, I'd much rather have Aryan and Plutarch and Diodorus and Curtius Rufus to a lesser degree than have nothing and be just reconstructing this incredible, momentous event from a handful of inscriptions and coins and medallions and things written down in Babylonian clay tablets. Those are additional sources which we will look at. But nonetheless, having these narrative histories are incredibly, incredibly important for reconstructing these events, even if, again, we have to remember they are all produced in a Roman imperial milieu. The concerns, therefore, may be concerns about the power of the emperor, concerns about the nature of Roman military and civil administration. And that doesn't mean that the facts that they give us are wrong, but we also have to realize that there is a filter, and it's a very Roman filter of who Alexander the Great was and how his campaigns went down. It's actually probably appropriate, and therefore maybe I'll leave you on this. Our most famous image of Alexander the Great's campaigns, that of the mural from Pompeii, it's a mosaic called the Alexander mosaic that actually shows Alexander charging against a retreating Darius. Also comes from a Roman context. This was a mural in a Roman, actually probably in an Italian house. It may have actually been laid down by someone who was an Italian subject and not yet a Roman citizen. It's oftentimes dated to around 100 BC. But nonetheless, the context even there of this iconic image of Alexander that may in fact be a kind of copy of a Hellenic painting, nonetheless comes from a Roman context, like so much of our knowledge about Alexander the Great. So those are some thoughts on our sources. We will talk finally about the campaigns themselves in the next video.